Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Thursday, June 13th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Conference Realignment Teams. I realized I hadn't tiered these teams into different, ready to compete right this second, ready to, hang around right in the middle of the pack, and we'll see what happens to them type of team. So I want to break down the different tiers as I see it for the Conference Realignment Teams going into this year. Then I want to get into Will Johnson. He made a very, very big statement a couple of days ago when he was talking about possibly playing both ways, doing a Charles Woodson type season over there at Michigan, and he did not say it was out of the question. So I want to break down what exactly he said and why it would be just an incredible thing to watch over there in Ann Arbor this fall. But then we'll get into the ACC. We've been going through every big conference the last couple of days. We've been doing win totals and Cinderellas through every conference, and we're now to the ACC. We are through all the Power 4 conferences as of today, but we'll probably do a little bit about the group of five, maybe pick out some teams, at least Cinderella-type teams that could make some type runs in the group of five for sure tomorrow. But after the ACC segments, we're going to get into a Hot Take Thursday to finish things out, and it's kind of about how tough this regular season is going to be in college football and how it might just make for some very interesting records by the end of the season. Let's just put it that way. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for both of us. Again, that is gsmcpodcast.net if you ever want to use that. But let's jump right in. And let's talk about the Conference Realignment Teams. It feels like, we're only 79 days out from the college football season, at least week 1, 72 days out from week 0. So that's the one that I count down to most of the time. But we have 13 new teams that are ready to take a new home in a Power 5 conference. Tons of people going all over the place. Every three I believe, all of the conferences have new members this upcoming year, which is very, very interesting. And, obviously, with the Pac-12 not being the Pac-12 anymore, definitely had a lot of people to go around. So it's going to be a fascinating year. A ton of different things changing, a ton of things kind of bouncing all over the place. And it is going to create kind of an interesting dynamic in college football. But I wanted to go through these teams and break down who are, in my mind, the immediate contenders, who are, in my mind, ready to compete, but maybe not ready to win the conference or do anything crazy. And then we'll get into the teams that are just kind of in the wait-and-see mode. We don't really know how they'll fit into the new conference, but definitely have the ability to build up. But as of right now, seem to be kind of on the lower end of the conference as they walk in. But let's kind of get into this, and I first want to start with the teams and immediate contenders. I think it's the three guys that we've been talking about a lot, Utah, Texas, and Oregon. I think when you look at those three guys, they absolutely can make noise in this upcoming year, can be the team that a lot of people, pick to win their conference. It could be that 3 of the Power 4 conferences are won by new members, and if it happens, it likely will be those 3. So let's start to break these guys down and give you guys an idea of where they all stand. And we'll start with Utah, a very, very talented team. I think they go as far as, Cam Rising goes. As long as he is healthy, as long as he is upright, this guy's going to make plays. He has shown that time and again, won 2 Pac-12 championships, did just incredible things throughout his career at Utah, and got one more year to work with. So definitely is going to be an incredible year for the Utes. Definitely a lot on the line. You're walking into a conference that you got to feel pretty confident that you can at least compete in, much less you can maybe the class of that conference coming in. So a lot riding on this year. I think Utah is ready to roll, and I would be honestly a little bit surprised if we didn't see them in Arlington. I think that's just how good this team is, and also their schedule is not quite as tough as some of the other teams in this conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Texas is the other team that I circled as an immediate contender. I think we can all agree that walking into the SEC, Texas is about as in good a place as you possibly could be. You never really know what's going to happen when you walk into the SEC. There's always a level of physicality, a level of intensity that you got to match. But if we're looking from a pure roster perspective and a pure guys perspective, there's no one that would be more ready than Texas right now. Ohio State jumping in would be more than fine. Oregon, I think, would be fine as well, but there's a very select few that could have made this jump and been at the top of the field, and it looks like Texas is right there. So as of right now, it feels like kind of a toss-up. You never really know what Texas is going to look like this upcoming year because they haven't played a full SEC schedule ever. So it'll be fascinating to watch how they adapt to that. I think they have every ability to win that conference, to win a national title in Sark's fourth year and really start taking off over there. But there is also the alternative that the SEC physicality just gets to them a little bit and they start to fall down those rankings just more and more. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. But then we got Oregon, a team that I think a lot of us are watching very closely in the Big Ten. I think a lot of people have kind of lost their love or their respect, or maybe just don't necessarily lean the way of Ohio State anymore in that conference. I think the last couple of years have obviously taken people a little bit away from Ryan Day and what he's selling over there in Columbus, but Oregon's the team that would kind of put all that, to shame. Would kind of put all that to bed and maybe win this conference in his first year. And Dan Lanning, if he was able to do that, would just be one of the best, maybe a second top two coach in the entire country after this year. With all of the things that happened this offseason, with all of the changes, with the transfer portal class, being able to get this team possibly to a Big Ten championship would be just remarkable to watch. So definitely going to be very interesting for that. But let's get to the ready to compete teams. And I think for me, it kind of starts with Oklahoma. And then you got Arizona, you got SMU, USC, Washington are the teams that I think are ready to compete in some form or another. Now, we'll figure out, are they really ready to compete, or is it going to be kind of an up and down type of proposition going forward? But let's start with Oklahoma. I think they're really fascinating to me because where I'm standing, if the offensive line works out the way that they want to, there's a 10-2 season in this in the books for Oklahoma. There's also a 7-5 season in the books for them. So this could be a huge year because when you get into the SEC, the biggest thing that I've noticed, at least over the last couple of, the last decade or two watching the sport, is when you have a down year in the SEC, it's not like having a down year in the Big 12. The down year in the Big 12, you're able to kind of bounce back, and you're also probably 9-3, not 7-5, 6-6. Now, it's much harder to bounce back in the SEC from a bad year because it kind of follows you around for a little bit. It happened to LSU for at least a couple of years there towards the end of the Ed Orgeron era, and you hope it doesn't happen to Oklahoma. I think Brent Venables has a ton going in the right direction, but it's a huge year for them just to, show that they belong. But let's get into Arizona, a team that is just having Noah Fafita and Tatori McMillan is absolutely huge for not only 2024, because obviously it's huge for 2024, but I think it's huge for this entire program. You need a jumping off point in this new conference that is going to give people confidence going forward and is going to give recruits confidence and maybe portal guys confidence to come into your program, and having those two guys essentially guarantees that you're going to make some waves. I don't know if they're going to be able to, totally tear the conference down, do incredible things their first year, but I know for a fact they're going to make a lot of really cool plays, and they're going to make a lot of plays against big-time teams. So it'll be fascinating to watch if they're able to kind of get up to the top of the Big 12 in year one, but at the very least, I think this team is going to be sticking around for quite some time and might just be a big-time transfer portal destination going forward. So they're very fascinating to me. I think they could be right up there at the top of the Big 12 in the next couple of years. And then you have SMU, one of the more wild cards of this group. I think they might just be overlooked just slightly. They're returning just so much production, particularly the quarterback Preston Stone, a remarkably good player that's kind of a dual threat type quarterback. And I think this team will sit probably somewhere in the middle of the ACC for a bit. I don't necessarily expect them to light the world on fire or do anything incredible, although they could. But I do think there's going to be a moment where they flash to the top for a year or two, and then maybe they flash back to maybe they go back to the middle right after that, but this is going to be a team that is capable of putting together maybe a flash-in-the-pan type team or a really talented team that can make an ACC title game. So I just would watch out for SMU in terms of they're going to be there at some point. They'll be in the conversation at some point. I just don't know when that's going to be. And then you got USC, one of the most interesting teams in the country. To me, I have full confidence that this is going to be a big-time player in the Big Ten going forward. I think Lincoln Riley has totally changed over the last couple of months when you talk about his approach to a football team, and it's showing on the recruiting trail. If you go into what USC has been doing on the recruiting trail the last probably 2, 3, maybe even a month, they've been doing incredible stuff. It's just incredible what they've been able to pull in, especially on the defensive side of the ball. It's different type of guys than he's been getting in the past. It's no longer, speed guys that have a ton of ability and all of that type of stuff. It's big old dudes that have a ton of ability and can kind of move guys off the line of scrimmage. So there's a ton going into this season. It feels like USC, it might not be 2024 where they make noise, but I think they're going to be right up towards the top at the end of maybe 2026 is probably a good moniker for where they will be in the Big Ten by that point. But let's get into Washington, a team that frankly I don't love in 2024. I don't necessarily love the amount of turnover. I don't think Jedd Fisch has a Noah Fafita in that room that can kind of come in with a cape and be Superman for that team. I think they're going to have to, kind of take their licks in the first year. And I could be totally wrong on that. I think Jedd Fisch, it wouldn't be the first time that he's proved me wrong about one of his teams, but I do think that this team is going to be built into a very good program. Jedd Fisch knows how to build a program. There's no two ways about that. And I think there's going to be an ability here that they're going to be able to at least compete going forward. Now, do I think they're going to win a Big Ten title in the next couple of years? Probably not, but it's still very much in the cards with what Jedd Fisch is capable of. But then let's get to the wait-and-see teams, the teams that are towards the bottom of their conferences as they walk in. I got UCLA, Stanford, Cal, Arizona State, and Colorado. 5 teams that I think have a lot to gain, but it's going to take some time. But let's start with UCLA, a very, very interesting team. And frankly, I have a lot of confidence in them going forward. Probably not in 2024, but 25, 26, towards the latter years in their Big Ten tenure. I think Deshaun Foster is going to be a really good head coach. I feel very confident in that. I think he is leading this program the way that it needs to be led and has that energy that they absolutely need. So I think he's a great addition. I think Stanford is the one that is likely looking at where they're going to be for quite some time. I wish I could tell you that Stanford's going to get back to the Andrew Luck, Christian McCaffrey type days, but it doesn't seem that way. I like Troy Taylor, and I think he's doing a lot of really good things over there, but there is a big-time talent gap between Stanford and the rest of the ACC, and I don't think they're necessarily going to close that anytime real soon. So I'd be a little bit worried about them going forward. I think they're going to be a solid team and slowly start to build, but it's going to take time, that's for sure. And then you got Cal. I think this is a team that I'm watching very closely because I think they're doing some things, especially in the transfer portal, that are really interesting. And I think they have the ability, they have a couple of players on that team, particularly Jaden Ott, that absolutely can make tons of big-time plays and make them a very dangerous team in this league. As of right now, it's kind of just the jury is out. I don't feel fully confident in what they're, gonna be going forward. So I think Cal is gonna be a good team. I'm not necessarily sure they'll be towards the top of the ACC anytime soon. But then we'll get into Arizona. I talked about them yesterday. I think it's just they're revving the engine at this program. They are sitting still, but everything is turning, and a lot of things are going right, and a lot of things are happening behind the scenes about the way that Kenny Dillingham relates to the players, relates to recruits, whatever it looks like. It feels like things are happening, but it just hasn't quite gotten there yet. But when they flip it into gear, I feel like this is going to be a big-time team. It's going to take time to get there, and it's definitely going to be a little bit of an uphill battle, but I liked Kenny Dillingham, and I think he has a juice that you absolutely need to be a successful head coach in this world of college football. And then finally, Colorado, one of the teams that, gets as much press as anyone in the entire country. And for me, this is all about, is Dion there in a couple of years or is he not? If he's there, then I think at some point he's going to be able to put together a contender of, the right transfer portal guys and the right group of guys coming together at the right time to compete in this conference. But right now, I don't know what the future of Colorado football looks like. I don't know who's going to be on the team. I don't know who's going to be on the coaching staff. I don't even know if they're going to be able to win a couple of games in a couple of years because who knows how this entire experiment ends up. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to be a solid team going forward. But until, there's a little bit more intensity around that program and much more depth around there, I'm not super confident. So it'll definitely be interesting to watch these kind of shift and change over the next couple of years. But as of right now, that's where I have all of the conference realignment teams. But we'll take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Will Johnson. It sounds like he wants to do a little bit of a act kind of that might be familiar to Michigan fans out there. We had one of the best players in Michigan history, obviously, playing both ways, one of the guys that absolutely turned the sport on its head in Charles Woodson. Sounds like Will Johnson kind of wants to be that guy, and he might just get his shot this upcoming year. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about tiering all of the conference realignment teams. Definitely some teams that are fully ready to compete, maybe even win the conference in their first year. A couple of teams that might just be right in the middle of that conference for a little bit, and then some teams that are just going to have to build up to the top of that conference. But let's get into Will Johnson, and let's talk about his big-time plans that he might have for this upcoming season. It sounds like Will Johnson wants to be kind of a Charles Woodson prototype, maybe a 2.0, if you will. He wants to be a two-way player for Michigan. He has made that very clear over his time at Michigan, was a wide receiver in high school, and a darn good one, honestly. I'll break that down a little bit later, but there's definitely a lot to go into this. This is obviously what Will Johnson wants. He really wants to play both ways. He wants to be a part of this offense, and it sounds like some of his teammates are more than on board for him to do that, but Sherrone Moore seems to be a little bit more hesitant, which makes total sense when you have a guy that is likely going to be a first-round draft pick at corner. I don't know how inclined you'd be to put him out there on offense as well. But at the end of the day, this would be an incredible thing to talk about. It would be absolutely wild to see what he would be able to do at the wide receiver position. And I think when you look at this Michigan team, there's some validity to what he's saying. This kid is an outright athlete. There's no two ways about that. 6'2", 202 frame. He can play wide receiver. There's no question about that. He was the number 3 cornerback in the 2022 class, but also had 666 yards his senior season, had 635 from rushing attempts and punt returns. He also got 600 yards in his junior year catching the ball. So the kid can play wide receiver. He just hasn't in a very long time. Since he's got onto Michigan's campus, it's been all about corner. It's been all about doing that type of thing. Now, it doesn't mean there hasn't been kind of some mix-up to where people play. I mean, Mike Sandristrell is probably the best example. Moved from wide receiver to cornerback and never looked back. One of the best nickelbacks from a year ago, and definitely I expect at least for him to have a very good NFL career. But it's going to be interesting to watch this unfold because I think when we go into this season, we all know that Michigan needs guys to step up at the wide receiver position. You need, whether it's Tyler Morris or Samaje Morgan or some other guys that have kind of come on as young players on that team, you're going to need someone, right? And you're going to need kind of a spark on that offensive side of the ball. And frankly, I see a reality where maybe there's, let's say week 2, they play Texas, and Texas comes into their house, and maybe it's not his best day. Alex Orji, that is. Maybe he doesn't throw the ball too well. Maybe he misses a couple of guys. Maybe even better. Well, not even better for Michigan fans, but in this argument, maybe he throws a couple of beautiful passes and they bounce off the receiver's hands into Texas players' hands. Maybe there's some mistakes in route running and communication problems and all of that type of thing. I would be a head coach. I mean, if I were in that position, it'd be really hard for me to not look at one of the best, maybe the best athlete we have on this team and say, you know what, why not? Take a couple of snaps, let's see what happens, let's see if you fit into this offense, and then we'll go from there. So it's one of those things that, frankly, right now I have not a ton of optimism that we'll be able to see him on both sides of the ball. As much as I want that to happen, I don't necessarily think that's in the cards, at least as of right now. It could be very quickly, because I think we all understand this passing offense isn't going to be like prolific. They're not going to do anything absolutely incredible, but at the end of the day, you need guys that can catch the ball. The thing that J.J. McCarthy benefited from greatly was he had Roman Wilson, he had Cornelius Johnson, two guys that you felt pretty confident when he was throwing them the ball because they were such sure-handed, really experienced guys that it made life a little bit easier. And Will Johnson obviously would not necessarily be that scenario, but sometimes you just need a spark. Sometimes you just need a new face, a new target for the quarterback to look at, and maybe it works out. So it would be fascinating to see what happens. Obviously, we talked about Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson finding their way out, but they also had Christian Dixon, they had Carmelo English, they had Darius Clemens, all find their way into the portal, and English and Clemens in particular were just huge guys coming out of high school, definitely would have been players for them going forward, but now they're kind of stuck with Samaje Morgan, who had just over 200 yards catching a year ago, Tyler Morris just under 200 yards, and then Frederick Moore was a kind of standout in their spring game, will likely be the third starter there. He had 32 yards a year ago, so in most, you're returning probably about 30 catches, about, 400 yards of offense from a year ago in terms of pass catching, and that is not ideal by any means. Obviously, you're not going to be the most pass-heavy team in the world, but you're going to need to be able to throw the ball. They did add someone in the portal, and it was a, really solid player, to be totally honest. They brought in a guy from Youngstown called CJ Charleston, was not necessarily that highly rated in the portal. Let's be totally honest, with all of the wide receivers that came in, a very talented guy. I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of where this guy fits in. He had 503 yards from a FCS program a year ago, Youngstown State, and was actually at Michigan in the first place. Was a wide receiver turned cornerback, left Michigan, found his way back to Michigan after all of this craziness that he's been through, and is likely going to be back at wide receiver. So it'll be fascinating to watch if he's someone that can, really make some strides into that. So we talked about Mike Sanders moving from wide receiver to nickelback, so it's not all that crazy, at least under Jim Harbaugh, and likely will be the same type of business under Sharon Moore. But you also had Khalil Mullings. He moved from, reserve linebacker to a really good running back. That's going to help them out this year. You also have Max Bredesen. He was a high school quarterback that turned into a really, really good H-back, tight end, fullback, whatever you want to call him. A very, very good player nonetheless. So there's a lot to like about this team, and there's a lot to like about possibly the fit of Will Johnson finding his way over to the offensive side of the ball, because I think there's this need at Michigan to have that game-changing guy. Now, last year you had Blake Corum. Last year you had Donovan Edwards. You had Roman Wilson. You had Cornelius Johnson. None of those guys, in my mind at least, were like the explosive, electric player that you're used to having on these championship level teams. They wore teams down. They played really good football. It's not to say that, those guys aren't remarkably talented. It's just to say they didn't gash teams by any means, but they were going to wear you down. And I think the best way they did that was no one really, had to stay on the field for too long. No one had to kind of push themselves in one direction too long in that offense. It felt like there were a lot of moving parts. There was a lot of rotation in between. There was a lot of running the ball. So the wide receivers and stuff got to take some plays off and got to kind of regroup for another play down the road. I think this year is going to be a little bit interesting because you don't have the Roman Wilsons, the Cornelius Johnsons of the world, where when you do have to get in these passing scenarios, you know they're ready to go. You're now handing the reins over to guys like Tyler Morris, guys like Samaje Morgan, who I really like both those guys. I think they're both very talented, and honestly, I think there'll be plenty in the passing game. But at the end of the day, you never really know until you get on the field. And there's a reality where you get to week 2 and some of these guys are just getting absolutely blanketed in coverage, and you can't get anyone open. And the run game maybe struggles a little bit because Texas can start packing the box and doing some things that on defense they wouldn't normally do against some other teams. So it is kind of that double-edged sword, right? You don't want to put Will Johnson in danger. You kind of want to protect him from himself in this scenario of playing probably too many snaps. I think all of us can agree Travis Hunter is an absolute anomaly. Even though I would love to see Will Johnson on both sides of the ball, I'd be a little bit shocked if he could play 115 snaps. Now, not to say he can't, or not to say it's not on in the cards, but I'd be a little bit surprised. I think he definitely has a ton of ability and definitely could be a huge help to this team, but likely the best help he can be to this team is as a corner and sticking as a corner. But it would be awesome to watch. I'll just put it that way. It's definitely something that I want just because if I can sit down and watch Michigan and have that really fun player on the field at most all times, I'm likely going to do it a lot of the time. It's kind of the Travis Hunter of the world where you don't know how well Colorado is going to play as a team. You know Travis Hunter is going to make a play or two. And Michigan is going to be a good team that also has this guy on it. So it would be an incredible thing to watch. I think there are plenty of people around the country who saw this and immediately ran to their coaches trying to make it happen. I'd be a little bit surprised if Will Johnson ended up making that jump, but maybe there's some dire straits that come into play, whether it's week 2 or a couple of weeks down the road. Maybe they just don't play all that well on offense the first couple of weeks and they're just looking for anything. And maybe the Will Johnson just pops up and makes some big plays. But it'll be fascinating to watch. I really hope this is something that actually happens. But if I was a betting man, I would bet it would be Will Johnson at corner all year, no question. Maybe he'll play a couple offensive snaps, but I wouldn't necessarily bet too much on it by any means. But it'll be an awesome thing to watch. Definitely love when two-way players come into our sport because it's appointment television, that's for sure. But let's take a break here. And when we come back, let's talk about the ACC. We've gone through every other Power 4 conference. Now it's time for the ACC win totals and Cinderella segment. So we'll do that. We'll do win totals first and then Cinderellas in segment 4. But we'll take a quick break, and then after that, we'll get into win totals for the ACC.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Will Johnson and how he really wants to play both ways for Michigan this upcoming year. Maybe do a little Charles Woodson impersonation this year, but I'm not necessarily holding out too much optimism, but I would love to see it, that's for sure. But let's jump into ACC play, and let's get into some win totals. There are definitely some teams that I think might just be a little bit too high, might be a little bit too low, a ton of teams that are right on the money, but the most interesting thing to me is who is at the top of these win totals, because it's not just one team anymore. It used to be, it was Clemson and everyone else, and that was the way the ACC worked for quite some time under Dabo Swinney. And now Florida State and Miami have just slowly been building up track, slowly kind of building up that gap that is formed between them and Clemson, both from a talent perspective and just really playing good football. They added new coaches since that, reign has happened with Mike Norvell and Mario Cristobal coming in. There's a lot of confidence, let's just put it that way, between those two teams, and I think it's now a 3-horse race in the ACC, which is something that I'm a big fan of. I think it makes it a little bit more fun for sure, but it definitely has got to make some Clemson fans just a little bit nervous. But Clemson has the ability to shut everyone up, including me, to be totally honest. They have the ability to show everyone that they're doing it the right way, that they are still the class of this conference, and they are still the class of this conference, have every ability to win this conference, and kind of assert their dominance over it once again. Cade Klubnik, in my opinion, might be the most important player in the entire conference. I think if he plays really good football, it might just be Clemson's conference to lose, to be totally honest with you, with what they have on defense. But that's a big if. If we've watched, the first couple of years of him, it's not necessarily been the most inspiring football in the world, but still a very talented player, definitely someone that could hit his ceiling and be really, really good. So Clemson's still at the top, but a lot of teams have joined them there. Florida State is a very interesting team. They have a remarkable amount of hype going into this season, and with hype comes a lot of pressure. We all know that. I think it's going to be really interesting. I feel like a lot of people going into this season just assume they're going to be one of the teams in Charlotte at the end of the year. I'm not quite as confident. Now, they definitely are one of the best teams in the conference, but I do think they have a ton of big-time challenges this year that might just get them at some point. That Week 0 game against Tech is absolutely huge. If you drop that game, there's going to be some very interesting conversations. And then Miami, being up here is just remarkable. The turnaround that they've had over the last couple of years, last year did not quite go the way that they wanted, but it feels like they're ready to roll. Cam Ward coming in was probably the highest profile transfer outside of maybe Will Howard going to Ohio State, and I think he's ready to take Miami back to the top of the ACC. If he does it, there's going to be a lot of talk from some Miami fans, and I don't know if we're all fully ready for that time, but it'll be fascinating to watch these teams. It's now a 3-horse race for this conference. And then you get into the 8.5 win total teams. You got Louisville, a very, very interesting team from a year ago, went to the ACC title game. They had tons of turnover, a lot of people going in, a lot of people coming out. But the reality is Jeff Brom did this last year, and he took it totally in stride. So I have some confidence in this Louisville team. I think Tyler Shuck is the absolute key to this team. If he can, really play some good football, they're going to be rolling. I feel pretty confident in that because they have a lot of other really good things in place over there. NC State, in my opinion, is the most interesting team in the conference. If Grayson McCall plays his best football, I think they can compete with every other team, and maybe he's the best quarterback in this conference, to be totally honest with you. He can do just really incredible things and run this offense at a remarkably high rate. And they have some dudes on the outside. They have Noah Rogers coming in from Ohio State. Kevin Concepcion is one of the most electric players in the conference. Justin Jolie coming in from UConn is absolutely huge. So I really like this team. I think they could absolutely make some noise. And then Virginia Tech is the team that I'm really falling in love with in this conference. I think Kyron Jones is one of the quarterbacks in this conference that is returning with experience. That is something that does not come very often across this conference this upcoming season. So it is definitely a luxury to have. I think they have the ability to win the conference, especially with the schedule they face, which is very manageable for sure. And then you get to the 7.5 win teams, North Carolina, SMU, and Syracuse. North Carolina is a fascinating team to me because you had Max Johnson come in to replace Drake May. Omarion Hampton is going to be the engine of this offense. There's no two ways about that. He's a really good engine for an offense, to be totally honest with you. And I don't think UNC will be any layup for a team in this conference. I don't necessarily think they're going to light the world on fire. Or I feel like 7.5 might be roughly the right number, although I'm not too big on UNC. But I don't think they're going to make life easy on a ton of teams. I think they're going to run the ball, play some at least okay defense at times, and try to steal some wins here and there. And then you have SMU with Preston Stone, a very interesting team. I think he's one of the more known commodities in the ACC when it comes to quarterbacks. There's not a lot of guys that I can look at and say definitively who they are. I can with Preston Stone. So I think that's a huge luxury for them. They're one of those teams that is going to be able to compete pretty much right away. And then if they pick up a little bit of steam or win some games they're not supposed to, things get really interesting in Dallas pretty quickly. And then you have Syracuse. They're the wild card here. Fran Brown coming in his first year of Syracuse has done just incredible things in the portal. Bringing in Kyle McCord is an absolutely huge pickup. They brought in a couple wide receivers that have been big time. So there's going to be some really, really good players out there for Syracuse, a much bigger talent level than they've had in a really, really long time. So I'm really interested in what the Orange can do this year. I absolutely love Fran Brown as a head coach, so I'm definitely going to be watching them very, very closely this upcoming year. And then at 6.5, you have California, a team coming in from the Pac-12. They're going to be really run heavy, kind of like UNC. Jaden Ott is one of the most electrifying players in the entire country, can carry the offense at times. I think bringing in Tobias Merriweather as a wide receiver from Notre Dame was absolutely huge, and I think they have the ability to pull off some upsets this year. I don't necessarily love the team overall, but I do think they have enough guys to kind of spring an upset here or there, maybe just be a Cinderella type team possibly. And then you get to the 5.5 teams, Duke, Georgia Tech, and Pitt. Duke is breaking in that new quarterback, Malik Murphy, someone that they really like, has just ridiculous arm strength, and definitely someone that can sling the ball all over the field. I don't think the portal was exactly kind to them outside of Malik Murphy. The coaching change is going to be huge, obviously, and Manny Diaz taking over his second head coaching reign. It's going to be a lot of eyes on him, but I do think they're going to play really good defense and kind of have that offense that just tries to get you a couple of times, tries to get you over top, throw a couple of deep balls from time to time, and just make life a little bit tough on you. But then we'll get into Georgia Tech, a very, very interesting team going into this year. I think Haynes King coming back is as big of a return for really anyone in the country. He did incredible things a year ago, led one of the best offenses in this conference, and they're right back to where they want to be to maybe do it again this upcoming year. So very fascinating team. Cannot wait to see what they do this upcoming year. And then you have Pittsburgh. Don't necessarily love this team. There's not a lot here that I can really sink my teeth into. I think they're going to be a solid team going forward. I think Eli Holstein is a very good quarterback that came over from Bama, but the reality is 2024 is going to be a little bit of a rough time in Pittsburgh. Then you get to the 4.5, Boston College, Virginia, Wake Forest. Boston College with Bill O'Brien as a new head coach is going to be really interesting, but it's going to take time for them to step up. I think Thomas Castellanos is a very fun player, but they're likely towards the bottom of this league for at least a little bit. And then you have Virginia, a best case scenario for them, pull an upset from here to there. You know, pull an upset, show teams that you at least can hang around with some of these teams and maybe pick up a couple of guys in recruiting and kind of slowly start to build. But right now it's just they're not going to be a player in the ACC this year. And then Wake Forest, kind of the same thing. Try to be the ruiner of a season. Try to be the team that throws a wrench into the works of one of the top teams in this conference. And then, at the very least, some people are looking at you as a transfer portal destination or maybe a recruiting destination. And then you have Stanford at the very bottom. As I said before, Stanford's going to be at the bottom of the ACC until further notice. I'd love to tell you that they're going to move up. It's going to be a tough year, and it could just be that's the way it is at Stanford for quite some time. But let's get into who I think is too high, too low. We'll kind of roll through this pretty quickly here. You got NC State at 7.5 and California at 6.5. I think those are a little bit too high. I don't love this UNC team too much. I think the defense is really going to struggle to keep up with some of the offenses around the ACC. Although they have some really good players like Camion Rucker and some other guys around that defense, I just don't love the group overall. And I think the big thing about this team is they're going to try to ride that running back. And if they can't do that because they're behind in games and it's Mac Johnson throwing the ball a ton, it's going to be rough. I'll be totally honest with you. And then Cal, kind of the same story. If you can't ride Jaden Ott, you're going to have a problem. That's just kind of the reality, and I don't think their defense is going to be good enough to not create some deficits for themselves and not create some precarious situations for them to be put in. So I don't necessarily love either of those teams and where they're at. The two low teams, I think SMU at 7.5 is too low, Duke at 5.5, Georgia Tech at 5.5. So let's start with SMU. I think SMU is a team that I love this year, if I'm being totally honest. Looking up and down this roster, I've yet to find too many big holes. Now, the talent level isn't necessarily a Miami or a Clemson level or a Florida State level team, but they have tons of guys that can play really good football and understand what is going to be asked of them every single day, and that's an absolute commodity in this league this upcoming year. They do miss Miami and Clemson on their schedule, get Florida State at home, so there's going to be really, really interesting games for SMU, and I think they might just be able to steal that Florida State game at home, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And then you got Duke at 5.5. I think they're going to follow a very simple formula that was kind of a pseudo-Bama formula from a year ago, where we're going to play defense, we're going to try to stop you as much as possible, and then we're going to beat you with some big plays, and we're going to win games, 24-21 or 27-24. It's not going to be very pretty, but we're going to make just enough plays. And I think with Malik Murphy, they absolutely have the ability to do that. And I think Manny Diaz is going to field a really good defense, to be totally honest. And then Georgia Tech, I think they have tons of upside this year. The issue is the schedule is an absolute battle. It's one of the toughest in the entire country, but I'd bet on the Jackets and Brent Key winning at least 7 games, because I think what Brent Key is doing over there in Atlanta is just been really, really fun to watch, and he's doing everything the way that he wants to, and it's working out pretty beautifully as of right now. And then everyone else is pretty much on the money. I think Pitt might be a little bit too high. I think Boston College might be a touch too low. But other than that, I mostly like this group. I think the ACC is really a tough one to keep track on. It's going to be a very interesting conference to watch and kind of unfold over this season, but for the time being, we're going to get into some Cinderellas. Right after this break, we're going to jump into 2 teams that I'm watching especially closely in the ACC to make some noise, maybe from a 5.5 win total, a 7.5 win total, something where not a lot of people are expecting a ton, but maybe they make some more noise than people are expecting. But we'll take the break here, and when we come back, we will unpack all of that, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into the ACC win totals. Definitely a lot of really interesting things in there. Some teams that I think could be making some runs that are very low on the win total, I'll be totally honest. But let's get into some Cinderellas, because these are the teams that I think might just be able to make a run from a very low win total. And for me, there are a couple of teams here that might be getting not enough talk, if I'm being totally honest, and it starts with the Yellow Jackets. I'll start with them because it might be a little bit harder to sell to some of you out there, I'll be totally honest, but it totally hinges on a pair of guys for this program, and it's Haynes King and it's Tyler Santucci, the new defensive coordinator. If both of those guys execute at a very high level, whether it's play calling, whether it's Haynes King, going through this offense the way he's done really well throughout his career, it's going to get really interesting. Because I think if you watched this team last year, you knew that if you had a really good or if you had a competent defense on that team, they're not a 6-win team. They're maybe a 7, 8-win team, and definitely a team that can compete with a lot of bigger teams in this conference. So Haynes King is one of the most fascinating guys in the country, if I'm being totally honest. I can't figure out why people aren't talking about him more, because the season he put up last year was just insane. It was one of the best dual threat seasons we saw a year ago. Obviously, everyone's playing for second behind Jaden Daniels, but it was definitely towards the top. He did incredible things running the ball, ran this offense just as beautifully as you can possibly run it, and Buster Faulkner did an incredible job calling plays for the first time in his career. I think it's only going to get better in year 2 with both these guys kind of in lockstep. The running backs are led by Jamal Haynes, a very talented, really kind of a player that runs much bigger than he is. I think he's 5'11", maybe 200 pounds, but the guy absolutely bowls over people. Now, 200 pounds helps a lot, I won't lie to you, but definitely does have a ton of ability, going to be a really good running back for them. And then you have Trey Cooley, who had 2 touchdowns in the opening game against Louisville a year ago, but then injured himself and wasn't able to really get back to where he wanted to be. So it's a really good duo. It's going to be a duo that definitely does exactly what Georgia Tech needs it to do. The wide receiver group is the exact same one from a year ago, which is absolutely huge for Haynes King in this program. Chase Lane, Malik Rutherford, Christian Leary are all going to be really solid options. The guy is Eric Singleton, though. He's the one that everyone should be watching this upcoming year because he was a freshman All-American a year ago. A very, very talented kid that can really play anywhere in the entire country. But he's playing at Georgia Tech. Keeping him on campus was, I'm sure, a little bit of a battle behind the scenes, but that's definitely something that I'm sure Brent Key had to deal with. But the O-line is a very interesting one. It's kind of the same as it was last year, returning a ton of guys, I think 4 starters from a year ago, and then adding a transfer in there. But when Brent Key is able to really get a group of guys together for not just 1 year, not just a couple of games, but an entire offseason, some really special things can happen. He's one of the best offensive line coaches in the country. When you talk about his time back at Alabama, there were some really good offensive lines in that group. So I definitely think they're going to be much improved on that side of the ball. Now, the defense is the side that you're worried about if you're a Tech fan. The D-line is not necessarily the strongest group in the world by any means. I think Zeke Biggers is a very, very good player. Definitely will be a big-time player for them. Kevin Harris coming off the edge is a very interesting player as well, but overall, it's just not necessarily the best group. You want, the total to be better than the sum of its parts. You want you want the group to be able to work together. That's probably the biggest goal here, just to make sure that everyone is in the right gap, doing the right thing, and then some guys will be able to make some plays. Not necessarily do anything crazy, but disrupt just enough. And then you had Kyle Efford and Trinalius Tatum in the middle of that defense. A really solid linebacker duo. They also added E.J. Lightsey over from Georgia, so they have a little bit more depth there in the middle of that defense that looked a little shaky a year ago. And then the back end is the one that I'm watching most closely. You still have LaMiles Brook back there. Amari Harvey is the guy that I'm watching most closely. I think he's going to be a fantastic player. Had a really good bowl game performance against UCF. And if he can build off that in 2024, it's going to be a pretty special season for this young man. I think there's a ton to like about this defense. A couple of guys that really can make some big-time impact. I think Efford could be a top guy in the conference at linebacker. I think Amari Harvey could be a top cornerback in the conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch. If you don't necessarily need to take a leap forward, you just need to take that one step. You need to, get a little bit better on defense, be opportunistic, and then things will happen from there. But that's definitely a really interesting team that I'm watching. Really like what Georgia Tech has. Although it's a tough schedule, I think they could make some noise in the ACC this upcoming year. But then I want to get to SMU, a very interesting team. I think they have a ton of talent going into this season, and I think when you look at this SMU team, they're coming in from another conference. Usually you kind of write off those teams, but they're fully ready to compete pretty much right away. They had a ton of transfers in 2023 that are back for their second season in the program, which is absolutely huge for that program and Rhett Lashley. And I think, I think there is going to be a huge amount of potential on this team to do some really remarkable things. Preston Stone is one of those guys that was non-transfer. He came in from high school to SMU and did just incredible things over his couple of years. He kind of reminds me of the Haynes Kings of the world, where he's just not going to make life easy on you. He's going to make the right decision. He's going to get it to the open guy, and he's going to slowly chip away at you. And I really like this quarterback. I think he can make some real noise this upcoming year. The running back room is actually remarkably talented, and it's because they're pulling guys from some bigger programs in Texas. They got Jalen Knighton. I believe he came over from Miami, to be totally fair. But Jalen Knighton coming over, LJ Johnson coming from Texas A&M. They also have Kamar Wheaton, who played really good football a year ago. All had 400 yards rushing a year ago. Knighton had 700. So it's a really good trio where they can change pace, they can change running back, keep legs fresh, do a lot of the things that you just need to do if you're going to be successful in this league. And then they also returned the top 7 pass catchers from a year ago. Jake Bailey and Moochie Dixon definitely lead the way as the wide receivers go. RJ Maryland is a very good pass-catching tight end. Over 500 yards for Bailey and Maryland a year ago. So it's going to be a solid group receiving the ball. And Preston Stone feels very comfortable throwing the ball to these guys. And then you have the O-line. They returned 4 starters from a year ago, added a very talented Savion Byrd from Oklahoma. I think Logan Parr is the guy to watch on this line. He could be one of the top offensive linemen in the conference at the end of the year. The D-line is it pretty much starts and finishes with Elijah Roberts, a very, very talented edge rusher, had 9.5 sacks since coming over from Miami. You also have Mike Lockhart, who's going to play nose tackle likely, a West Virginia transfer. Then you have Corey Roberson, a very, very talented guy, and Cameron Robertson, who had 4 sacks a year ago. So overall, a really solid group. The pass rushing is going to be really solid, honestly. And then you had, at the linebacker group, you had Ahmad Walker, you had Kobe Hudson, both of the leading 2 tacklers from a year ago. Hudson is going to be the leader of this group and definitely be the green dot guy for this group, but Walker is no slouch by any means. 2 absolute beasts in the middle of that defense, and that helps a lot of things. There's no two ways about that. The next 2 leading tacklers on the team are Isaiah Nakuba and Isaiah Wokbia and Jonathan McGill, 2 very talented safeties that absolutely can get downhill and lay a lick on someone. So very much like those 2 guys, could make some noise this upcoming year. And I think this SMU team, when you look at it, just has so much potential because they have so many people that are returning for their second, for their third, fourth year in the program, and they know exactly what they need to do, exactly how the offense is supposed to be run, and it's going to be a really, really tough out for most of the teams in this conference. I think as long as they play opportunistic defense and make a couple of plays, which they have the guys to do that, I think this offense is going to be able to score some points and make life really difficult on some teams out there. But it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think Georgia Tech and SMU might be a little bit off the beaten path, but Georgia Tech is a team that I think has tons of talent that could absolutely beat essentially any team in the conference. And then SMU, when you have that amount of returning production and returning experience in a conference that doesn't necessarily have that across the board, you're going to be pretty successful. So like those teams a lot. I think they're going to be really interesting going into the season, but we're going to take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to do a Hot Take Thursday for you all, and it has everything to do with this regular season and how it's going to be an absolute fight to go undefeated in it. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some Cinderellas in the ACC. I highlighted Georgia Tech and SMU in that conference. I think they're 2 teams that might just be able to spoil some things for the top dogs in there. But let's get to segment 5. Let's get to a Hot Take Thursday. And I don't think anyone's going to go undefeated in the regular season, at least in terms of Power 5 teams. I thought about including the Group of 5 in here, but I'm not confident that Liberty just won't roll through that Conference USA schedule. So I kept it to the Power 5, but this is definitely a very interesting one. I think when you look at the past couple of years, it is, scorching hot. If you look at what this year holds and a lot of the different schedules out there, it might just not be hot enough, if I'm being totally honest with you. There are so many really tough schedules out there, especially from the teams that you used to see going undefeated, are now playing some tougher teams, that's for sure. When you look at last year, there were a couple of teams that were definitely above 10 wins in the win total going into the year. UGA was sitting at 11.5, so there was a good bet that they were going to go at least undefeated in the regular season and then figure out what happens from there. You also had Bama, Ohio State, Michigan at 10.5. You had USC at 10. So definitely some high win totals going into a year ago. This year is just 4 teams, and it's the 4 teams that we've talked about a ton with Ohio State, Oregon, UGA, and Texas. All those teams have the ability to definitely make some noise and go undefeated, but I just don't think they will. I think this conference consolidation has created some real battles, and it's not going to be easy to get out of any of these without being at least taking one loss. But let's get into this, and let's start with the teams that are going to probably define this the most. And let's start with Georgia, definitely a team that has the ability to go undefeated. And to me, they're just playing way too many tough games. I think it's not, crazy to say that they can win all these games because they likely will be favored in all of them and likely will be the better team in all of them. But the reality is when you play at Bama, at Ole Miss, at Texas in 1 year, it's going to be remarkably hard to go undefeated in those 3 games. And also on top of that, you also have Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee just waiting right there, and then Clemson to open the year. So at some point, I think they're going to get clipped. Now, Kirby Smart does not take any kind to anyone saying they're going to get clipped in the regular season. I kind of hope that they use this as a motivation going into this season. But the reality is, I just am not really betting on Georgia to be able to go through what is a gauntlet of a schedule undefeated. So wouldn't necessarily bet on them. Ohio State is an interesting team because the schedule is a little bit more manageable than Georgia's, to be fair, but it's not necessarily easy by any means. Going to Eugene and State College are not going to be easy. Remarkably tough atmospheres. If State College is a whiteout that night, it gets even more tough, but that doesn't seem like it's going to happen as much as I want it to. You also have Michigan coming to Columbus. Obviously, that's a game that you pretty much have to win, but it didn't mean much when they came to Columbus last time. So we'll figure out what happens there. Then you also have teams like Nebraska and Iowa just sitting right there ready to play spoiler. So I don't necessarily bet on Ohio State to make that type of run. I think at some point they get clipped, whether it's at Eugene, at Penn State, the Michigan game at the end of the year, I don't know. But definitely I feel like one of those is going to get them. And then you have Texas, a very, very interesting team. This is the schedule that might be the most manageable, if I'm being totally honest. I think there was a lot going into this season for the SEC and Texas, but they got a pretty manageable schedule. Going to Michigan and Georgia are absolutely the big ones. You also have Oklahoma, A&M, Kentucky, Florida right there as well. So that's the difference when you move over to the SEC. There's not just going to be a couple of big-time inflection points. There's going to be about 10 of them throughout your season, and if you don't deliver on all 10 of them, you might just fall a couple of times. So I think Texas is at least going to take one loss in this new year in the SEC, but will still be a very good team. And then you have Oregon. I think they're really fighting Ohio State and then going to Michigan. I think they definitely have the ability to make this all work. They honestly might have the easiest schedule out of these 4, where after that, you really have Boise State, Washington, you have to go play Wisconsin, but not necessarily the craziest schedule in the world. They have a couple of inflection points. If they hit on those days, this is the team that could go undefeated for sure. But then you have some teams that are at 9.5 wins that absolutely could be in this group as well. And let's start with Bama. I think, frankly, I don't have many problems with this Bama team. I think they're a lot better than people give them credit for, and I think Jalen Milroe is going to play a lot better than people are giving him credit for, but I just think this back end is going to get gashed one time. There's bound to be one weekend, whether it's Georgia coming to town or playing LSU or what have you. Some offense is going to get them, and they're going to get them for about 400 yards, 3 scores, and it's going to be a really tough day at the office for Alabama. So I just don't necessarily think that position group in particular is quite ready to compete week after week the way that they're going to need them to. And then you have LSU. It's just the defense. There's going to be one game where they give up 50 points, and it all looks really disjointed and really weird, and the offense just not able to keep up. So when I look at this team, it's, a hair worse offense, a hair better defense, and I think that probably lands them at about 9 wins. So I don't necessarily love this team to go undefeated especially. And then you have Ole Miss, probably the biggest wild card here, but in my opinion, they're threading a needle with these portal additions. It's not going to be easy to make all this work, especially against an SEC schedule, so I wouldn't necessarily bet on this team, at least not to stumble once. And then you have Tennessee, a very, very talented team, bringing in Nico Iamaleava and him being the starter. A lot of confidence going into this season, but at the end of the day, when you have to play an SEC schedule as a first-year starter, it's going to be tough, and you're going to get got at least one time by a really good defense. Plus, they play at Georgia this upcoming year. So I don't know if that's ideal for Nico. I think they're going to at least take a loss possibly there, but maybe a number of other places against Alabama, against LSU. There's a million games that are going to be really tough for Tennessee this upcoming year, and I just think this quarterback is going to have one tough game in the bunch at least. And then you have Michigan, a very fascinating team, breaking in a new quarterback. They're going to be underdogs at home in week 2, so I'd honestly be surprised if they pulled that off, if they won that game, but honestly, they definitely could. And even if they did, to be totally honest with you, they still got to play Penn State, they still got to play Ohio State, they still got to play Oregon. In fact, they do play Penn State, excuse me, but Oregon is going to be a huge game. Ohio State, obviously a huge game. I just think they get got at some point if they don't in week 2. So definitely going to be an interesting team this upcoming year, but I think Texas gets them in week 2 if I'm being totally honest. And then you have Penn State, another Big Ten team that could make some noise. I think they're just not going to be very good on offense in one of these weeks. So there's going to be a week, whether it's Ohio State or Michigan, I feel pretty confident it's going to be one of those games. If that happens, it's just not going to go very well. You can play as well of defense as you want, even though they probably took a little step back on the defensive side of the ball this year. The offense is just not going to be able to execute one day. It's just going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know why it's going to happen, but it seems to happen a lot up there in State College, and I think it's going to happen against one of those big-time teams, and you're going to suffer a loss, but doesn't mean the season's over by any means. Definitely still a lot to look forward to for Penn State. And then you have Florida State, a very interesting team going into this year. Definitely going to be a really, really tough proposition to get through this schedule undefeated. Now, it is a little bit of a manageable schedule. They can definitely pull off all of these games. They'll likely be favored in, if I'm being totally honest with you. But that week 0 game against Tech gets more and more sketchy the more I think about it. I think when you play Clemson, Miami, when you play some of these teams, you have to go on the road to SMU. It's just not going to be easy. I don't think they walk out of here with at least not one loss. And then Clemson's going to be a fascinating team because if Cade Klubnik hits, they could go undefeated. That sounds insane. I fully understand that. Frankly, I don't think they'll get through week 1 against UGA, if I'm being totally honest. But let's just say they do. Then things get really interesting, and maybe this is the team that could go undefeated. But frankly, I think they'll be lucky to be undefeated by week 2, if I'm being totally honest. And then you have Miami, the other ACC team that is hanging out. I just think there's a point in this season where Miami's just going to look disjointed. There's tons of transfers coming in. There's tons of different things moving around. And there's going to come a point where this offense just doesn't click the way you want to. Or maybe the defense at the back end looks a little bit all over the place. So there's going to be one of those games. I don't know who it comes against. It's probably going to come against someone they don't want it to come against, like Georgia Tech last year. But the reality is there's going to be a game where it's just not going to look very great for Miami. At least that's the way that I think, at least. And then you have Kansas State, a very interesting team going into this year. I just think it's going to be nearly impossible to go undefeated in this Big 12 conference. There's too many teams packed too close together, and Kansas State plays too many of them. They don't play Utah, which is a huge win, but they play about everyone else that is right towards the top of this conference, and getting out of it undefeated is just going to be a really tall order. And then you finish it out with Utah. This is the team that actually might have the best odds outside of the top 4 teams that we talked about earlier. They do have Arizona. They go to Oklahoma State, at Colorado, Iowa State. So plenty of places that they could stumble. And frankly, I think they're going to stumble at Oklahoma State in that game. But at the end of the day, this is the team that if I were to pick one outside of that top 4, that's probably the group that I would pick. Although I probably wouldn't pick them if I'm being totally honest. So overall, it's going to be insanely tough to pull this off. When you have all of this conference consolidation and do away with divisions did a big part in this, and all of the different things that have kind of gone into this season, the scheduling just got so much more tough for a ton of different teams, whether it's Texas, Oklahoma, Georgia got a ton tougher this year. Michigan got a little bit tougher. A ton of things have happened around scheduling, and I think it's going to be really hard to go undefeated this year. I think we're going to see a ton of 11-1, 10-2 type teams out there, and we're going to see a ton of battles in these SEC, Big 10, Big 12, ACC championships where Maybe it's two 11-1 teams. Maybe it's 11-1 and a 10-2, and they're fighting for that spot to get that bye. So it'll be fascinating to watch these things unfold. I think if I had to pick one team, it would be Ohio State. I think they have the ability to go undefeated this year and definitely have the motivation to go undefeated, but I still wouldn't bet on them. I think they're going to stumble at some point, and it's going to get them at some point, whether that's at Eugene or hopefully it's not Michigan for Ohio State's sanity. But I do think they get got at least one time. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. I think it'll make for some really compelling television down the stretch of the season where you have tons of teams that are really fighting for life in some of these scenarios where you already have a loss or you already have two losses and you're trying to get into your conference title game. So I think it's going to be fascinating. I think you'll see a lot of 11-1, 10-2 type teams at the end of the year, and frankly, I absolutely love it. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a ton to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing just incredible work across every single sport you could think of. So anything you need in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we totally have you covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.